Everyone loves a good illusion until it breaks, until the person you defended, trusted, maybe even admired is suddenly exposed in a way you never expected. Because the truth doesn't knock politely, it crashes in uninvited, undeniable. And when it doesn't just reveal who they are, it reveals who chose to ignore it. Truth has a quiet way of existing beneath everything, even when it is buried under layers of denial, distraction, and carefully constructed appearances. It does not need validation to be real, and it does not depend on whether people acknowledge it or not. You can ignore it, avoid it, reshape it, or even try to replace it with something more convenient. But truth has a persistence that outlasts every attempt to suppress it. It lingers in the background of conversations, in the discomfort you feel when something doesn't quite add up, and in the subtle inconsistencies that slowly begin to reveal themselves over time. No matter how convincing the illusion may seem in the moment, there is always a fracture point where reality begins to push through. People often believe that if something is hidden well enough, it ceases to matter. They convince themselves that distance, time, or silence can erase what is real. But truth is not something that disappears, it is something that waits. It waits in patterns of behavior that cannot be sustained forever, in emotions that eventually contradict the story being told, and in situations where pressure forces authenticity to surface. The more effort someone puts into hiding the truth, the more fragile their reality becomes, because maintaining a lie requires constant control, constant awareness, and constant performance. And no one can perform forever without making a mistake. What makes truth so powerful is not just its existence, but its timing. It does not always reveal itself immediately, and that delay often creates a false sense of security. People begin to believe they have gotten away with something, that the narrative they created has replaced what actually happened. They grow comfortable in the version of reality they've built, forgetting that truth does not operate on their timeline. It surfaces when the conditions are right, when contradictions become too obvious to ignore, when evidence aligns in a way that cannot be dismissed, or when the weight of maintaining the illusion becomes too heavy to carry. And when it finally emerges, it does so with a clarity that makes everything before it seem obvious in hindsight. There is also a psychological cost to hiding the truth that people rarely acknowledge. Even when something remains concealed from others, it does not remain hidden from the person carrying it. It influences their behavior, shapes their reactions, and creates an underlying tension that seeps into everything they do. They become more defensive, more cautious, more reactive to anything that threatens to expose what they are trying to keep buried. This internal pressure builds over time, often leading to cracks in the very image they are trying to protect. In trying to control how they are perceived, they lose control over how they actually behave. At the same time, those on the outside are not as unaware as they might seem. People sense when something is off, even if they cannot immediately articulate what it is. Intuition picks up on inconsistencies long before logic can explain them. Small details begin to stand out. Things that don't align, words that don't match actions, emotions that feel out of place. These observations accumulate quietly, forming a picture that becomes harder and harder to ignore. And while people may choose to overlook these signs for the sake of comfort or convenience, they do not disappear. They remain in the background, waiting for the moment when everything connects. When truth finally surfaces, it does not just expose the reality of a situation, it also exposes the illusion that surrounded it. It forces a confrontation between what was believed and what actually is, and that contrast can be deeply unsettling. The narratives people created to protect themselves begin to collapse, and the clarity that follows often feels overwhelming because it reveals how much was overlooked or misunderstood. In that moment, there is no more room for interpretation, no more space to hide behind uncertainty, only the undeniable presence of what has always been there beneath the surface. Charm is one of the most powerful tools a person can possess because it disarms people before they even realize they need to protect themselves. It creates an atmosphere of ease, of likability, of trust that feels natural and effortless. When someone knows how to present themselves well, how to speak in a way that resonates, how to mirror emotions and appear deeply understanding, they can shape how others perceive them without ever revealing who they truly are. Image works the same way. It is carefully constructed, polished, and presented in a way that highlights strengths while hiding inconsistencies. Together, charm and image form a convincing narrative, one that people are often willing to believe because it feels good, because it aligns with what they want to see rather than what is actually there. But charm is a performance, and performance has limits. It can be maintained in controlled moments, in conversations that are managed, in situations where the person has time to think about how they are being perceived. What it cannot sustain is repetition under pressure. This is where patterns begin to reveal themselves. Patterns are not about isolated moments. They are about consistency over time. They show up in behavior that repeats itself, in reactions that follow the same emotional script, in choices that expose priorities, no matter how well they are disguised. While charm can make a single moment feel convincing, patterns expose the truth across many moments, and that is something far more difficult to manipulate. People often ignore patterns because they are less dramatic than a single shocking event. A lie can be denied, a mistake can be excused, and a moment of inconsistency can be explained away. But when the same behavior appears again and again, it becomes harder to dismiss. Still, many choose to focus on the charm instead because it offers immediate comfort. It allows them to justify what they are seeing, to believe that the person they want to trust is still aligned with the image they have accepted. This is how deception continues, not because the truth is invisible, but because it is inconvenient. Patterns, however, do not rely on belief. They exist whether or not someone chooses to acknowledge them. They are revealed in how someone handles conflict, how they respond when things don't go their way, how consistent their words are with their actions. A person can say all the right things, present themselves in the most appealing way, and create an impression that feels genuine. But if their behavior repeatedly contradicts that impression, the pattern becomes the truth. And unlike charm, patterns cannot be turned on and off at will. They are rooted in habits, in mindset, in character. There is also a level of emotional investment that makes patterns harder to accept. When someone has already decided who they believe a person is, recognizing a conflicting pattern requires them to question their own judgment. It forces them to confront the possibility that they were misled or that they ignored signs they should have taken seriously. This discomfort often leads to rationalization. People tell themselves that the pattern isn't significant, that it's temporary, that it doesn't define the person. They cling to the moments of charm as evidence that the pattern is an exception rather than the other way around. Over time, though, patterns accumulate in a way that becomes undeniable. They form a track record that cannot be erased by a few convincing moments. Each repeated behavior adds another layer of clarity, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the illusion created by charm and image. What once felt like isolated incidents begin to connect, forming a consistent narrative that reveals far more than any single interaction ever could. And when that realization finally settles in, it shifts perception completely because it replaces assumption with evidence. This is why patterns hold more truth than presentation. Presentation is intentional. It is designed to influence how others see you. Patterns are unintentional. They reveal who you are when control slips, when effort fades, when reality overrides performance. They show what a person defaults to, not what they want others to believe. And in the end, it is not the moments of charm that define someone, but the behaviors they repeat when there is nothing to gain from pretending. People rarely miss red flags because they are invisible. They miss them because they are inconvenient. A red flag is not always loud or dramatic. More often, it is subtle, quiet, and easy to rationalize in the moment. It appears as a slight inconsistency, a behavior that feels off, a reaction that doesn't quite align with what was expected. But instead of stopping and questioning it, people tend to smooth it over with explanations that preserve their comfort. They tell themselves it's just a misunderstanding, a bad day, or something temporary. In doing so, they prioritize the version of reality they want to believe over the one that is quietly revealing itself. There is a certain emotional investment that makes ignoring red flags almost automatic. Once someone has formed a positive impression, they begin filtering new information through that belief. Anything that supports it is accepted easily, while anything that challenges it is minimized or dismissed. This is not a conscious decision as much as it is a psychological tendency to maintain consistency in how we see others. Admitting that a red flag matters would mean questioning the entire perception, and that kind of uncertainty feels uncomfortable. So instead, people adjust their interpretation of the red flag to fit the narrative they have already chosen. Another reason red flags are ignored is because they rarely come with immediate consequences. They don't always lead to an instant breakdown or an obvious problem. Instead, they exist as small warnings, signals that something is misaligned. Because nothing dramatic happens right away, it becomes easier to believe that nothing is wrong. Time passes, and the absence of immediate consequences reinforces the idea that the concern was unnecessary. This creates a false sense of security, where people start to trust their decision to ignore what they initially felt. But red flags are not meant to create immediate disruption. They are meant to reveal patterns over time. Each one is a piece of a larger picture, and while one piece may not seem significant, multiple pieces begin to form a clear image. The problem is that by the time enough red flags have accumulated to create undeniable clarity, the situation has already progressed much further than it should have. Emotional attachment has deepened, trust has been established, and the cost of walking away has increased. What could have been addressed early becomes much harder to confront later. There is also a tendency to confuse potential with reality. People see what someone could be, what they might become, or what they appear to represent in certain moments, and they allow that potential to outweigh the actual behavior in front of them. Red flags are then viewed as temporary obstacles rather than indicators of deeper issues. This creates a gap between expectation and reality, where the focus shifts from what is happening to what could happen if things improve. In that space, red flags lose their urgency, and the person continues forward, hoping the situation will align with their expectations. Clarity, however, has a way of forcing itself into the situation when consequences appear. And consequences are rarely subtle. They disrupt, they expose, and they demand attention in a way that red flags never do. What was once easy to ignore becomes impossible to overlook because it now has a tangible impact. The discomfort that was avoided earlier returns with greater intensity, often accompanied by a sense of realization that the signs were there all along. The difference is that now they can no longer be rationalized away. When consequences force clarity, the perspective shifts almost instantly. The same behaviors that were once excused are now seen in a different light. The same moments that were overlooked are now recognized as warnings that should have been taken seriously. This shift is not because the situation suddenly changed, but because the cost of ignoring it became too high to justify. The mind no longer looks for ways to preserve the illusion. It looks for understanding, for explanation, for truth. And in that moment, the most difficult realization is not just about the other person's behavior, but about one's own willingness to overlook it. Because clarity does not only expose what was wrong, it also reveals how long it was allowed to continue, how many opportunities there were to address it, and how often comfort was chosen over awareness. Accountability is often misunderstood by those who have spent most of their time avoiding it. To them, it does not feel like a natural consequence of their actions. It feels like an attack, a sudden shift in how they are treated that they believe is undeserved. When someone has built their sense of self around avoiding responsibility, they begin to expect that their actions will either go unnoticed or be excused. Over time, this expectation turns into a kind of entitlement, where being held accountable feels less like correction and more like betrayal. They are not reacting to the truth of the situation. They are reacting to the loss of control over the narrative they have been maintaining. Avoidance of accountability is rarely obvious at first. It begins in small ways, deflecting blame, minimizing mistakes, or shifting focus onto others. These behaviors seem minor in isolation, but they create a pattern where responsibility is consistently redirected. The person learns that they can navigate situations without fully owning their actions, and each time this works, it reinforces the belief that accountability is optional. This is where the disconnect begins. Instead of seeing accountability as a normal part of growth and interaction, they start seeing it as something imposed unfairly, something that disrupts their ability to maintain a favorable image. When accountability finally arrives in a way that cannot be avoided, it creates a strong emotional reaction. This reaction is not necessarily about the situation itself, but about the sudden exposure of what has been hidden or denied. The person is no longer able to control how they are perceived, and that loss of control feels threatening. Rather than accepting responsibility, they may interpret the situation as a personal betrayal, especially if the accountability comes from someone they trust. In their perspective, that person has shifted from being supportive to being critical, even if the intention was simply to address reality. This sense of betrayal is often rooted in expectation. When someone has consistently avoided accountability, they come to expect that others will continue to allow it. They interpret tolerance as agreement and silence as acceptance. So when someone finally challenges them, it disrupts the pattern they have relied on. The reaction is not just to the accountability itself, but to the breaking of an unspoken agreement that they believed existed. They may feel that they are being treated unfairly, not because the accountability is incorrect, but because it is unfamiliar. There is also an internal conflict that makes accountability difficult to accept. Acknowledging responsibility requires a level of self-awareness that can be uncomfortable, especially if it contradicts how someone sees themselves. If a person has built an identity around being right, being misunderstood, or being the victim of circumstances, accepting accountability forces them to confront a different reality. It challenges the narrative they have been telling themselves, and that can feel destabilizing. Instead of adjusting their self perception, it often feels easier to reject the accountability and view it as an external problem. Over time, this resistance can create a cycle where accountability is consistently avoided, and each instance of it is met with defensiveness or denial. The person becomes more focused on protecting their image than on understanding their behavior. They may surround themselves with people who reinforce their perspective, avoiding those who challenge it. This creates an environment where accountability becomes even more foreign, and any attempt to introduce it feels increasingly confrontational. The longer this pattern continues, the stronger the reaction becomes when it is finally broken. What makes accountability feel like betrayal in these situations is not the act itself, but the contrast between expectation and reality. The person expects to be understood without being questioned, to be accepted without being challenged. When that expectation is disrupted, it creates a sense of loss, not of trust, but of the ability to avoid responsibility. And in that moment, accountability is not seen as an opportunity for growth or clarity, but as a violation of the dynamic they had come to rely on. Emotional manipulation rarely presents itself as something obvious or aggressive. It often arrives wrapped in vulnerability, concern, affection, or even apparent honesty. It does not immediately feel harmful because it is designed to lower defenses, to create a sense of connection that makes questioning it seem unnecessary or even unfair. The person using it may appear deeply understanding, emotionally expressive, or unusually attentive, which makes their behavior feel genuine rather than calculated. But beneath that surface, there is often a different intention, one that is less about connection and more about control, less about truth and more about influence. What makes emotional manipulation effective is its subtlety. It does not force, it guides, it does not demand, it suggests. It creates situations where the other person begins to doubt their own perception, question their own reactions, or feel responsible for emotions that are not theirs to carry. This shift does not happen all at once. It develops gradually through repeated interactions where boundaries are blurred and clarity is replaced with confusion. The manipulated person often finds themselves adjusting their behavior, not because they have consciously decided to, but because they have been emotionally steered in that direction. At its core, emotional manipulation is often a way of compensating for something deeper. It can mask insecurity where a person does not feel confident enough to be accepted as they are, so they attempt to control how they are perceived. It can hide a lack of accountability where instead of addressing their own actions, they redirect attention onto the emotional reactions of others. It can even conceal a need for dominance, where influencing someone's feelings becomes a way of maintaining power in the relationship. These underlying flaws are not always visible at first because the manipulation itself is designed to keep the focus elsewhere. One of the most common ways manipulation masks deeper issues is by shifting responsibility. Instead of addressing their own behavior, the manipulator reframes the situation so that the other person feels at fault. They might express hurt in a way that implies blame, or they might present themselves as misunderstood in order to avoid being questioned. Over time, this creates a dynamic where the manipulated person becomes more focused on managing the manipulator's emotions than on understanding the reality of the situation. The original issue becomes secondary, replaced by an ongoing effort to maintain emotional balance. There is also a pattern of inconsistency that often accompanies emotional manipulation. Moments of warmth and connection are interspersed with moments of withdrawal, confusion, or subtle criticism. This inconsistency keeps the other person engaged, constantly trying to regain the positive connection they experienced before. It creates a cycle where emotional highs are followed by lows, and the desire to return to the high becomes a driving force. This pattern is not random. It serves to deepen attachment while maintaining control, ensuring that the manipulated person remains invested despite the underlying instability. What makes this dynamic particularly difficult to recognize is that it often appeals to empathy. The manipulated person may see the manipulator's behavior as a result of past experiences, stress, or emotional pain, and this understanding can lead them to excuse or overlook what is happening. They may believe that with enough patience or support, the situation will improve. In doing so, they shift their focus away from the impact of the behavior and toward the perceived reasons behind it. This allows the manipulation to continue because it is no longer being evaluated on its effect, but on its justification. Over time, however, the deeper flaws that the manipulation is masking begin to surface more clearly. The patterns become harder to ignore, the inconsistencies more noticeable, and the emotional impact more significant. What once felt like isolated incidents begins to reveal itself as a consistent approach to interaction. The person who seemed emotionally open may now appear strategically expressive. The concern that once felt genuine may begin to feel conditional, and the connection that once felt natural may start to feel controlled.